The rise of Arminius, a Roman soldier with a Germanic soul, the man who changed history. Arminius. To the Romans, he was a traitor. To the Germanic tribes, he was a liberator. But history is rarely black and white. The story of Arminius is not just about one man, but about the fate of an empire and the people who resisted its might. To truly understand the impact of this enigmatic figure, we must explore the world that created him, the forces that shaped him, and the decisions that led to one of the most shocking defeats in Roman history. Imagine standing in a dense, misty forest, the towering trees blocking out the sun. The sound of marching soldiers echoes through the narrow path, their armor clanking, their banners fluttering. They are confident after all. They are the Roman legions, the most powerful military force the world has ever known. Yet, hidden among the shadows, thousands of warriors wait, ready to spring a trap that will shake the foundations of the empire. But before we get to that fateful moment, we must understand how Arminius, a young Germanic prince raised by Rome, became the architect of its greatest humiliation. This is a story of identity, betrayal, and the clash of civilizations. The Roman Empire and Germania in the 1st century BC. At the time of Arminius' birth, Rome was transitioning from a republic to an empire. Augustus, Rome's first emperor, had solidified his control and embarked on campaigns to expand and secure the empire's borders. One of these unstable frontiers was the vast, untamed region of Germania. Unlike the well-organized provinces of Gaul and Hispania, Germania was a wild land of thick forests, swampy terrain, and fiercely independent tribes. For Rome, Germania represented both an opportunity and a threat. It was a source of potential recruits for the army, but also a land filled with rebellious, unpredictable warriors who could never fully be controlled. The Romans had made attempts to integrate Germania into their empire, establishing outposts and alliances with local chieftains. But these alliances were fragile, and the Germanic tribes were known for their fierce resistance to foreign rule. Among these tribes, the Cherusei stood out. They were a proud people, skilled in guerrilla warfare, and deeply resistant to Roman influence. And it was among them that Arminius was born. Arminius, a hostage of Rome. Around 18 BC, Arminius was born into the noble class of the Cherusei tribe. His father, Segimur, was a leader of the tribe, which had complex relationships with Rome, sometimes allies, sometimes enemies. As part of Rome's strategy to ensure loyalty from the Germanic tribes, young noble sons were often taken as hostages and raised in the Roman world. This was both a form of insurance and a means of Romanizing the next generation of tribal leaders. Thus, Arminius was taken from his homeland at a young age and brought to Rome, where he was given a Roman education, trained in military strategy, and eventually became a member of the Roman auxiliary forces. Unlike the common legionaries who served for 25 years, auxiliary commanders like Arminius enjoy more freedom, higher pay, and the ability to maintain ties with their native lands. This system was designed to ensure that these warriors remained loyal to Rome, but in Arminius' case, it had the opposite effect. A Roman soldier with a Germanic heart. As Arminius grew, he became a skilled warrior and strategist. He fought alongside the Romans, learning their tactics, their weaknesses, and their arrogance. He earned Roman citizenship, was elevated to the equestrian class, and gained the trust of high-ranking officials. But deep down, he never forgot his roots. During his service, Arminius participated in the Great Illyrian Revolt 06-09 AD, one of the largest uprisings against Rome. It was here that he saw firsthand how Rome dealt with rebels' brutal massacres, the destruction of entire settlements, and the systematic suppression of local cultures. Watching these horrors, Arminius began to question his loyalty. If Rome could do this to the Illyrians, what would stop them from doing the same to his people in Germania? The seeds of rebellion were planted. The return to Germania. In 07 AD, Arminius was sent back to Germania, not as a prince of the Cherusei, but as a Roman commander tasked with securing the loyalty of the tribes. However, he had other plans. Instead of ensuring Rome's dominance, he began secretly organizing a resistance movement. Arminius was uniquely positioned to lead such a rebellion. He understood Roman military tactics better than any other Germanic leader, and he had the trust of the Roman governor, Publius Quinctilius Varus. Using his position, he gathered intelligence, identified Rome's vulnerabilities, and slowly built alliances among the Germanic tribes. His return was not without conflict. His father, Segimur, was still loyal to Rome, as were many other tribal leaders. But Arminius had a vision, one of a united Germania, free from Roman rule. His charisma and strategic mind won over many warriors, but his ambitions also made enemies among his own people. One such enemy was Segestes, a nobleman who remained loyal to Rome. The two men's rivalry intensified when Arminius eloped with the Snelda, Segestes' daughter. This personal feud would later have major consequences. The master plan. By 09 AD, Arminius' plans were in motion. He had carefully laid the groundwork for what would become one of the greatest ambushes in history. His knowledge of Roman logistics, his ability to manipulate Varus, and his alliances with other Germanic tribes all pointed to one fateful event: the Battle of the Teutoburg Forest. He convinced Varus to lead his legions through a dense, unfamiliar forest, promising that it was the safest route. In reality, it was a carefully chosen killing ground. The Romans had no idea they were walking into a trap, a disaster that would change the course of history. The perfect trap. The Teutoburg Forest Massacre, a battle that shook the empire. In the annals of history, few battles have altered the fate of empires as profoundly as the Battle of the Teutoburg Forest. Rome, the eternal juggernaut of conquest, had crushed Carthage, subdued the Greeks, and absorbed the grandeur of Egypt. Yet, in a dark and mist-laden forest, far from the heart of civilization, 3 Roman legions were about to be erased from existence. The mastermind behind this disaster, a man whom Rome had trained, trusted, and elevated, Arminius. But this was no ordinary battle. It was not fought in open fields where Rome's iron discipline could prevail. It was a masterpiece of deception, psychological warfare, and terrain manipulation. To understand how so-called barbarian army outwitted the greatest military force in the world, we must delve into the intricate web of betrayal and strategy that led to one of Rome's most devastating defeats: Rome's overconfidence and the illusion of control. By 09 AD, the Roman Empire had extended its influence deep into Germania, but unlike Gaul or Hispania, this was a land that refused to be tamed. The forests were endless, the rivers treacherous, and the people fiercely independent. Despite this, Governor Publius Quinctilius Varus saw Germania as another province in the making, a land ready for taxation, law, and Roman order. But Varus made a fatal mistake. He underestimated the tribes and overestimated his control over them. He saw the Germanic chieftains as divided, too primitive to pose a real threat. And above all, he trusted Arminius, a Germanic prince who had served Rome loyally. He had no idea that this very man, who dined at his table and pledged allegiance to the empire, was secretly orchestrating his downfall. Arminius' strategy: turning Rome's strengths into weaknesses. Arminius was no ordinary rebel. He was a tactician, a manipulator, and above all, a man who understood Roman warfare better than most Roman commanders. He knew their reliance on structured formations, their logistical vulnerabilities, and their trust in their own invincibility. His plan was simple, but brilliant: lure the Roman legions into a terrain where their strengths would become their weaknesses. The chosen battleground: the dense, swamp-ridden paths of the Teutoburg Forest, a place where formations would break, where supply lines would collapse, and where panic would spread like wildfire. Arminius used his position as a Roman officer to convince Varus that a rebellion was brewing among distant Germanic tribes. He suggested taking a shortcut through the forest to quell the unrest. Varus, blinded by his arrogance and misplaced trust, agreed. The march into the abyss. The Roman legions, numbering around 20,000 men, set off into the forest. Alongside them were supply wagons, women, children, and camp followers, an unwieldy, slow-moving column that stretched for miles. As they ventured deeper, the terrain became harsher, the path narrowed, the mud thickened, and the towering trees swallowed them whole. Then came the first attacks. Arminius had vanished, under the pretense of rallying allied tribes to support Rome. Instead, he had gathered his own army, a coalition of Carusi, Chatti, Bructeri, and other Germanic warriors. They waited in the shadows, watching the Romans struggle through the terrain. The first wave of attacks was swift and precise. Arrows rained down from unseen archers. Javelins struck exposed soldiers. The Romans, caught off guard, tried to form their famous testudo formations, but the uneven ground and scattered ranks made it impossible. Panic spread as the realization dawned this was not an isolated skirmish. This was an ambush. The massacre unfolds. For 3 days, the Romans fought desperately to break free. But every attempt to reorganize was met with another ambush. Germanic warriors used the forest to their advantage, striking and disappearing like ghosts. The weather turned against the Romans, as heavy rain made the already treacherous terrain even more impassable. Verus, seeing his army disintegrate, made a grim decision. He and his senior officers fell on their own swords rather than be captured. Leaderless and demoralized, the remaining soldiers tried to flee, but there was nowhere to run. By the third day, the Roman legions had ceased to exist. The survivors were either slaughtered or taken as slaves. The eagle standards, the sacred symbols of Roman power, were seized, a humiliation that would haunt Rome for decades. Aftermath. The ripple effect across history. When news of the disaster reached Rome, Emperor Augustus was reportedly so shaken that he wandered his palace in despair, crying, "Quinctilius Verus, give me back my legions." The psychological blow to Rome was immense. Never before had an entire Roman army been annihilated in a single battle. Germania was abandoned as a province, and the Rhine River became the empire's de facto frontier for centuries. But what if Rome had responded differently? Could they have reconquered Germania? What if Verus had been more cautious, or if another general had been in command? The what-ifs of history make this battle endlessly fascinating. Arminius, though victorious, did not live to see a united Germania. Tribal rivalries resurfaced, and he was ultimately betrayed and murdered by his own people. Yet his victory ensured that Germania would never become another Roman province, altering the course of European history forever. A legacy written in blood. The Battle of the Teutoburg Forest was more than just a military defeat for Rome. It was a turning point. It proved that the Roman war machine was not invincible, that disciplined legions could be undone by cunning and terrain. It was a lesson in arrogance, in the cost of underestimating one's enemy. For Arminius, it was a moment of triumph, but also of fleeting glory. He had struck down an empire, but in doing so, he had unleashed forces he could not control. His people would not unite under his banner, and his dream of a free Germania remained just that, a dream. Yet, his name endures. He is remembered not just as a warrior, but as a symbol of resistance, of a man who dared to defy the greatest power of his time. And in that, his legacy remains immortal. Rome strikes back. The wars of vengeance. The empire's wrath unleashed. When word of the disaster in the Teutoburg Forest reached Rome, it was not just a military defeat, it was a wound to the very soul of the empire. Augustus himself, the man who had turned Rome into an empire, reportedly wandered his palace in despair, repeating the chilling words, "Quinctilius Verus, give me back my legions." The unthinkable had happened. 3 entire legions, the finest warriors of Rome, had been wiped from existence. But Rome was not an empire that took humiliation lightly. The massacre had shattered the illusion of invincibility, but it had not broken Rome's will. Revenge would come, swift and brutal. The legions would return to Germania not as conquerors, but as executioners. The next phase of Arminius' war was about to begin. And this time, the battle would be fought not on his terms, but Rome's. The aftermath of Teutoburg. In the immediate wake of the battle, Germania erupted into chaos. The tribes, emboldened by Arminius' victory, launched attacks on every Roman outpost east of the Rhine. Roman garrisons were slaughtered, towns were burned, and the last remnants of Roman authority in Germania were wiped away. For Arminius, this was a moment of triumph but also of growing danger. The Germanic tribes were not a unified nation. They were bound together by temporary alliances, rivalries, and personal ambitions. And now, with Rome seemingly vanquished from their lands, old grudges began to resurface. Meanwhile, in Rome, Augustus knew that the survival of the empire depended on how it responded. To allow Germania to remain free was to invite future rebellions in other provinces. The empire's very prestige was at stake, and so, he turned to the man who could restore Rome's honor, Tiberius, his heir and one of Rome's most skilled generals. Tiberius and the first counterattack. Tiberius was no stranger to war. He had fought across the empire, from Pannonia to Armenia, and had earned a reputation as a methodical, ruthless commander. When he was given command of the counterattack in 10 AD, he did not rush in blindly, as Verus had. Instead, he waged a war of attrition. Rather than march deep into Germania, Tiberius secured the Rhine, fortifying the frontier. He launched precise, disciplined raids, burning villages, seizing supplies, and weakening the Germanic war effort. He did not seek a single decisive battle, he sought to strangle Germania slowly. Arminius, for all his brilliance, struggled against this new kind of warfare. The Germanic tribes were warriors, not an organized standing army. They were used to ambushes, to fast-hand brutal engagements, but they were not equipped to fight a prolonged campaign against a disciplined, supply-rich enemy. By 12 AD, Tiberius had restored order to the Roman frontier. Germania had been blooded, but not yet conquered, and so, Augustus decided that the final blow would not come from Tiberius. Instead, he turned to another rising star in the Roman military, Germanicus. Germanicus, the empire's avenger. Germanicus was everything Rome needed in a hero. Charismatic, fearless, and beloved by his soldiers, he was the embodiment of Roman virtue. And he had a personal reason for vengeance. His own family had suffered humiliation because of the Teutoburg disaster. When he took command in 14 AD, Rome was ready to wage total war. Germanicus led a massive army, perhaps as many as 80,000 soldiers across the Rhine. His goal was not just to punish the Germans, but to destroy them. The campaign was brutal. Germanicus burned villages, executed prisoners, and desecrated sacred Germanic sites. He understood that this was not just a war of swords, but of psychology. The Germanic tribes had won once, but he would make them believe they could never win again. One by one, the tribes that had once rallied behind Arminius began to waver. Fear crept into their ranks. Could they truly defeat Rome a second time? But Arminius was not finished. The clash of titans, Arminius versus Germanicus. In 15 AD, the two greatest military minds of their generation finally met in an open battle. Arminius had gathered his forces near the Weser River, ready to face Rome's might. The battle was long and bloody, but this time, Rome had learned its lesson. Germanicus outmaneuvered the Germanic forces, using cavalry and disciplined infantry charges to break their formations. Unlike Varus, he did not fall into traps he set his own. In the end, Arminius was forced to retreat, but he was not captured. He had survived, but at a terrible cost. Rome had proven that it could still dominate in open warfare. And yet, the Germans refused to surrender. No matter how many villages were burned, no matter how many warriors were slain, Germania would not bow. The political reality. Why Rome abandoned Germania? After years of brutal warfare, the question loomed: should Rome continue the conquest of Germania? Germanicus wanted to press on, to finish what had begun. But back in Rome, the new emperor Tiberius saw things differently. The war was costly, the legions were stretched thin, and worst of all, Germania had no great cities, no wealth, no infrastructure worth conquering. Unlike Gaul or Hispania, it offered nothing but endless war. Tiberius made a decision that would shape history. Rome would not seek to conquer Germania. The legions were pulled back behind the Rhine, and the dream of a Roman Germania died. For Arminius, it was a victory but a hollow one. He had saved his land, but he had not united his people, and soon, his greatest enemy would not be Rome, but his own kin. The empire strikes, but cannot conquer. The Roman campaigns of vengeance were a demonstration of power, but also of limitation. Rome had shown that it could not be humiliated without consequence. It had avenged Teutoburg, but it had also acknowledged that some lands were simply not worth the cost of conquest. For Arminius, the war had transformed him from a victor into a survivor. He had outlasted Rome's wrath, but he could not change the fundamental nature of his people. The Germanic tribes would never unite, and his vision of a great Germania would remain just that, a vision. But history remembers him, not as a Roman soldier, not as a mere rebel, but as the man who defied an empire and won. The fall of Arminius, the price of victory. A hero's lonely end. Arminius had defied the greatest empire in the world and won. He had annihilated 3 Roman legions in the Teutoburg forest, driven the invaders back to the Rhine, and forced Rome to abandon its dreams of conquering Germania. But victory did not bring peace. Without Rome as a common enemy, old tribal rivalries resurfaced. Arminius, once hailed as Germania's great liberator, now faced a new battle, one that could not be fought with ambushes or military tactics. His people did not want a king, and his enemies were no longer foreign legions, but his own countrymen. This is the story of Arminius' final struggle, a war not for Germania's freedom, but for his own survival, the unraveling of unity. The Germanic victory over Rome was unlike any other in history. No conquered city had been burned, no spoils had been taken, only blood had been shed. And for a brief moment, Germania had been united in purpose. But Germania was not Rome. It had no senate, no emperor, no central authority. It was a land of independent tribes, each with its own chieftains, its own traditions, and its own ambitions. With the Romans gone, The unity that Arminius had forged through war began to crumble. Many chieftains had fought not for Germania, but for revenge, for plunder, or simply because they had followed the momentum of war. Now that the battle was over, the question loomed: what came next? Arminius believed that the Germanic tribes should remain united, that they should form a confederation strong enough to resist future Roman aggression. But not everyone agreed. Many chieftains saw no need for further unity. To them, Arminius had served his purpose. He was no longer a war leader, he was a man with ambitions beyond his station. Betrayals and internal struggles. Arminius' greatest challenge was not Rome, it was the nature of his own people. Unlike the Romans, the Germanic tribes valued independence above all else. Even during the war, Arminius had struggled to command full loyalty. Now, in the absence of an external enemy, that loyalty was dissolving. His most dangerous rival was Maroboduus, the king of the Marcomanni. While Arminius had led a rebellion against Rome, Maroboduus had chosen a different path. He had maintained a cautious alliance with the empire. After the war, the two leaders clashed, not just ideologically, but militarily. In 17 AD, Arminius led his warriors against Maroboduus, hoping to unite Germania under his leadership. But even though he won the battle, he did not win the war. Maroboduus retreated, but Arminius failed to solidify his rule. Other chieftains, seeing him as too ambitious, began to turn against him. One of the most painful betrayals came from within his own family. His uncle, Inguiomerus, defected to Maroboduus. Others followed, fearing that Arminius sought to make himself a king, something that was anathema to the fiercely independent Germanic way of life. The fall of a legend. By 19 AD, Arminius was isolated. He was still a respected leader, but his influence was waning. The Romans, though no longer actively trying to conquer Germania, kept a close watch from across the Rhine. They saw the fractures forming and knew they no longer needed to fight Arminius. His own people would do that for them. The end came not in battle, but through treachery. In 21 AD, Arminius was assassinated by members of his own tribe, likely at the behest of rival chieftains who saw him as a threat to their power. He died not as a king, not as a conqueror, but as a man who had fought for a dream that his people did not share. Tacitus, the Roman historian, later wrote, Arminius began to aim at kingship and found himself in conflict with the independent temper of his countrymen. He was attacked by arms and, while defending himself with checkered results, fell by the treachery of his relatives. Thus ended the life of the man who had humbled Rome, but who could not rule his own people. The legacy of Arminius. Arminius' death did not mark the end of Germania's resistance against Rome, but it did mark the end of his vision. The Germanic tribes continued to fight among themselves, and though they remained free from direct Roman rule, they never truly united as Arminius had hoped. Yet his impact on history was undeniable. His victory at Teutoburg Forest changed the course of the Roman Empire. The Rhine became the permanent frontier of Rome, and Germania remained unconquered. The empire would never again attempt to subjugate the region. In the centuries that followed, the Germanic tribes would grow stronger, eventually playing a key role in the fall of the Roman Empire itself. Later generations, particularly in the 19th and 20th centuries, would hail Arminius as a national hero, a symbol of German resistance against foreign rule. The name Hermann, a later Germanic form of Arminius, became a rallying cry for German unity. Monuments were built in his honor, and his story was retold as a legend of defiance and triumph. But perhaps the greatest irony of all is that Arminius fought not for Germany, for no such nation existed, but for a dream of unity that his own people rejected. A warrior, a rebel, a legend. Arminius' life was one of contradiction. He was raised by Rome, fought for Rome, then turned against Rome. He won a battle that changed history, yet could not secure his own future. He sought to unite his people, yet was murdered by them. And yet, his name endures, not as a ruler, not as a king, but as a warrior who stood against the greatest power of his time and won. His story is a reminder that victory does not always mean success, and that the greatest threats often come not from enemies, but from within.